Dr. Niki Vincent is a force of nature disguised as a soft-spoken academic, but don't let that fool you. This is someone who has stared down police commissioners, university vice-chancellors and fire chiefs, armed with nothing but data, determination, and an unwavering belief that equality isn't a nice-to-have, it's a fundamental right. As Victoria's inaugural Public Sector Gender Equality Commissioner, Niki oversees groundbreaking legislation that covers over 300 organisations and 380,000 workers, making Victoria the first state in Australia to mandate gender equality with real teeth, real consequences, and real transparency. But her journey to this role reads like a testament to resilience itself. Born in England and arriving in Australia as an 11-year-old 10-pound pom, Niki left home at 15, had 4 children by 25, completed her studies as a single parent whilst working part-time, earned not 1 but 2 university medals, and completed her PhD whilst serving as a CEO and caring for her daughter through life-threatening illnesses. If that wasn't enough, she's also a foster parent, stepmother, and grandmother to 10. Before taking on Victoria, Niki served as South Australia's Equal Opportunity Commissioner, where she conducted explosive investigations into systemic discrimination in the police force, fire service, and universities. Investigations that didn't just gather dust, but drove real measurable change. Her approach is both compassionate and uncompromising. She wants to bring everyone along, but won't tolerate those who refuse to take equality seriously. What makes Niki's work particularly relevant to our mission at Maslow is her understanding that true systemic change requires more than good intentions. It requires institutional transformation, accountability mechanisms, and the courage to challenge entrenched power structures. Whether we're talking about gender equality in the workplace or financial equality in society, the principles remain the same: transparency, accountability, and systems that serve the many, not the few. Niki, welcome to Chasing Financial Equality.
Thank you so much, Kane. What a very flattering introduction. Thank you.
Well deserved, I think. You've had an extraordinary personal journey, leaving home at 15, becoming a mother of 4 by 25, and completing your studies as a single parent whilst working. How did those early experiences shape your understanding of systemic barriers and inequality?
It's a really good question because, I think at the time, the experiences certainly made me resilient. I absolutely recognize that. I don't think that when I was in the midst of all of that I recognized, like I do now, how systems have been built to serve some people much better than others. I think I was just trying to get through, trying to make a life and help my kids thrive. And when you're navigating motherhood, study, financial instability simultaneously, those barriers can be really crushing. And too often I think people blame themselves and feel ashamed of struggling and they don't want anyone to know. And that was certainly the way that I felt. And that's understandable because we can be hugely judgment about other people's struggles. And I faced plenty of that judgment as a teenage mother. When I grew up, and the place that I grew up in, it wasn't uncommon for people to marry young and have children young. You know, I grew up in a sort of very poor area in South Australia, one of the poorest in actual fact. And most people that I went to school with did not go on to university. And as you said, I was kicked out of home when I was 15. I kind of worked to pay my way through school and so forth. And I think I met the person that eventually became my first husband when I was 15. And I think being alone and kind of struggling on my own, I think I got married young because I wanted stability and security in my life, and that was the choice that I made. And I when I had my first baby, I got pregnant when I was 18. I went to the pediatrician, and it was my first kind of appointment with a pediatrician in the city. And I dressed up and I dressed my daughter up in, our best clothes. And the first thing the male pediatrician said to me was, "What are you going to do?" And I kind of went, "What do you mean? What am I going to do?" And he said, "What are you going to do about the baby? Like, are you going to give her up for adoption?" I was stunned, and just the judgment that he'd made because I looked so young, and I did look young for my age, but I was astounded. And, that sort of knocked me backwards. And then when I had my second daughter, which was only 16 months later, so I was still kind of a very young mum, I was walking along the street with a twin stroller, and we didn't have any money. So I'd bought these two $20 Kmart strollers, and we'd strapped them together together so I could manage the two babies together. And I was struggling because when you have a contraption like that, it doesn't really work very well up and down curve. And I was struggling to get over the road and up the curb. And there were these two male police officers standing there, and they both had a little smile on their face. And I thought they were smiling nicely at me. And as I got the push chairs up over the curb, one of them said to me, "Serves you right." And I realized it wasn't a generous smile, it were of compassion. It was actually a judgment. And there were lots like that. When my second daughter had a brain aneurysm and I took her to hospital, I was ignored. People ignored me. The nurses dismissed me. It was 3 days that she was in hospital before anyone paid attention to me because I was kind of just a teenage mum. So I guess like so many other people, I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to be one of those successful people. I wanted to make something of my life to achieve the best outcomes for my kid, as I said. And so I battled away trying to exceed people's expectations of what a teenager mother could ever become without thinking about the system.
In that story, you focus quite a lot on receiving judgment from people in positions of power or authority, or potentially with an implication that they owe you a duty of care. Do you think that plays a very significant role in your work in the public sector, ensuring that people who do have those positions don't judge the people they interact with on a daily basis?
Absolutely. It's so much a part of how I think now. And I guess it's really kind of, really, those experiences now are very much a part of my story. I would not have talked about them back then. You know what I mean? So it really has, I was always a feminist from my very early high school days, and probably before then, actually, because I have a younger brother and I witnessed the privilege he received and found it deeply unfair. And at first I wished I was a boy and I tried acting like a stereotypical boy. But then as I grew up a bit, I was much more of what I would call a liberal feminist. I didn't really question systems themselves. I just believed that women should have equal access to them. And of course, this can mean encouraging women to contort themselves to fit into patriarchal systems rather than changing those. And I definitely thought that that women should try to pretend that they didn't have these barriers, that, that's how we would get equality by, being able to fit ourselves into those systems. And I'm looking back, I'm sure I didn't think deeply at all about race or class or disability or any of those intersecting barriers, although I was definitely experiencing the intersection of gender and class discrimination myself. I think one of the wake-up calls that I had was, actually, you mentioned the university medals, and the first one came to me in the midst of getting, my husband at the time had just said he was having an affair, left me with 4 kids. I was kind of in chaos. The top story of my house had burned down, and it was like the last thing I was thinking about was going to my graduation. And then this letter came through that said, you are to receive the first university medal that the university had ever awarded. And they just decided to bring in university medals at the University of Adelaide. And it was a wake-up call for me because I was parenting and working and studying all at the same time. I hadn't really connected in with my fellow students very much. And I had no idea that they weren't all getting the same grades as me. And I was really hard on myself. If I got, a high distinction, I thought, well, why didn't I get an even higher one? It's ridiculous when you think about it, but that's how it was. And this university medal award coming through, and I gave my honours supervisor a call and said, it's obviously a mistake. And he said, it's not, Niki. There isn't anyone even close to you, and I want you to own it. You deserve it. And I thought about it, and I felt lucky. I felt like, for all the challenge that I was facing, I was lucky to be born smart because, yes, I worked hard, but if I wasn't born smart, I wouldn't have been able to do what I was able to do in spite of the challenges. And it was that kind of recognition that I had that many people aren't born smart, with intelligence or at high intelligence. And I know that kind of sounds arrogant, but it's not meant to. But the responsibility that I felt to actually do something with my life was an absolute wake up call to me. And it was then that I really set out on the career that kind of morphed into where I am now, learning a lot along the way and transforming my own feminism along the way, I guess.
You've described such an interesting acknowledgement of what could very well be considered privilege, intelligence, being born through luck to be someone who has particular traits or characteristics about them. I think recognition of privilege is an important topic at the moment. It's so crucial to see that you, whilst being born into a life where you struggled, didn't have a lot of money, and you made choices that led to certain outcomes that you might not have made in retrospect, and yet you were still capable of identifying the privileges that you did have. And I think that's a really important ability for people to take from.
Yeah, look, I agree, but, doesn't mean that there haven't been other privileges that I've had. And it was much later on, I think, that I recognized that, I can look in the mirror every day and not think about the color of my skin. Whiteness is seen as the standard, if you like.
Yeah.
For so much of what's been created that I never have to think about that. I have a foster daughter who was born in Africa. And her experience has really consolidated my understanding of my own privilege, raw and real ways. When I have been out with her and we've been in shopping centres and, shop assistants have followed us around. I never get followed around.
Yeah.
I see how she's treated often, and that's made me recognize my own privilege. And yes, I've kind of deliberately put myself into those situations, although I didn't deliberately look to foster a person of color, but exposing myself to situations like that and recognizing them has been very much a part of the kind of learning experience for me. And that's not done, obviously. There's still a lot of work to do in that regard.
I like your explanation of privilege, looking in the mirror and not having to think about the color of your skin. I'm a part of the queer community, but I don't experience life the same way many people in the queer community do, because I am white, I am male, and arguably I present, in a more traditionally masculine presentation, whatever that might mean to every person. And so when people within my community talk about certain experiences that I haven't experienced, I really have to remind myself that whilst I might be part of that community, I don't experience life the same way. And I think that's a really important distinction. The intersection of personal and systemic inequality. When people face financial stress, whether it's a single parent trying to balance work and study or someone caring for a sick family member, they often experience it as a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. From your own experience and your work, how do you help people understand that many of these struggles are actually symptoms of systems designed around a particular type of person's life circumstances?
Yeah, well, like I said, I totally identified with that and felt ashamed and tried to to pretend that it wasn't the way that it was. And I wanted to fit in with successful people and to be taken seriously. And I totally felt that if I was struggling, I couldn't be those things or do those things because people would look down on me. And I guess, that's something I had in a subtle way kind of picked up on. And my absolute favorite book ever, and I'm sure you've heard of it, Kane, Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women. It's a global bestseller, and it really has, I think, changed the world because so many people quote from the book examples that she's put, but it basically provides compelling evidence of how our systems are literally built, our systems, our products, our services are literally built around male bodies, schedules, and life patterns. And, taking something as basic as workplace design and, office temperatures are typically set based on the metabolic rate of a 40-year-old man weighing 70 kilos. And that was, back in the 1960s when women weren't spending perhaps as much time in offices as they are now. But that means it leaves women consistently cold. You'll see women in, jackets and jumpers with scarves and men in shirt sleeves. More seriously, I think crash test dummies designed using male bodies until very recently, making cars significantly more dangerous for women. Women are 47% more likely to be seriously hurt, and 17% more likely to die. And, one of the examples that she has is the toilet queue. And this one for me is fantastic because every person who's been to a public event will have experienced the toilet queue outside of a woman's toilet. Basically we've got equal space for women's and men's toilets because I think probably the men who designed the building code designed them that way without thinking about gender. And women take 2.3 times longer on average to use the toilet because they have periods, they can't use urinals, they often have small children with them, they get pregnant, over and over and over. There are so many things that mean women need more toilet space with more cubicles, and they're not oversights. They're systemic exclusions that make women's experiences seem like personal problems or women's problems rather than design failures. And that same pattern appears in work structures. The traditional full-time employment assumes someone else is handling the domestic responsibilities, what feminist economists call the male breadwinner model. And when a single parent struggles to balance work and study, or someone caring for elderly relatives can't maintain conventional work patterns, they're not failing the system is failing them. Research by scholars like Nancy Fraser shows how our economic structures depend on unpaid care work, predominantly performed by women, while simultaneously penalising those who do it, which are women. And
Yep.
Criado Perez talks about how women are not more likely to take part-time work, not by choice, but because full-time positions don't accommodate caregiving responsibilities, and yet part-time work typically comes with lower hourly wages, fewer benefits, and limited career progression. So when women struggle financially, it appears to be a personal choice rather than a structural constraint. And neoclassical economists and human capitalists, I read her columns in The Australian and they make me so grumpy because she ignores the stereotypes channeling women into narrow, lower paid pathways, gender norms about unpaid caring and how this is valued or not valued, as it is the case, discrimination and power dynamics in workplaces and society. These things are socially constructed. They're not natural or inevitable. The healthcare system provides another stark example where, medical research has historically excluded women from clinical trials, treating male bodies as the default. Consequently, women's heart attacks are more likely to be misdiagnosed because symptom patterns present differently than the classic male pattern. Women struggle to get proper health care. They're often dismissed as anxious or attention seeking rather than recognised as a victim of systems designed around male physiology. And so whether it's the way that jobs are structured, the unaffordability of childcare, or the lack of proper support for carers, these aren't individual problems, they're design flaws. And when we name them as such, it gives people both clarity and power, and, can transform the shame into righteous anger. And I see this in the audience every time I give a speech, and I use Caroline Criado Perez's examples where people are, they're aghast when they think about it, and then they're really angry. And I think that can turn individual struggle into collective action.
I spend a lot of time focusing on language because obviously we have enormous complexities and challenges in our world, and language is to learn from the climate movement because there's so many people focused on it. Sometimes it comes out with language that I think the language that is used in climate around the externalization of costs, the oil industry that externalizes the costs of its operation onto the environment and as such society as we see it. And, overlaying that to how women experience life and people who are not, cisgendered heterosexual white men, it's really about systems that externalize the cost of their inadequacies onto the people they're not designed for.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I like the way that frames the fact that these systems, which are designed primarily for one stereotype of person, benefit that person at the cost of those external to that design.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's really important, and a reason why the Gender Equality Act that I implement here in Victoria, this brand new legislation, one powerful obligation on duty holders is to put a gender lens over all of their policies, programs and services that have a direct and significant impact on the public. And I think that's our secret weapon, really, because the data that we collect on workplaces, as you mentioned, the 300 duty holder organisations and so forth that have to provide us with data about their own workplaces across 7 key indicators of gender inequality, including pay gaps and sexual harassment and a whole bunch of other things. And then they have to create plans to address any inequality that they find. That data comes from HR systems and so forth. Really important data that is making an impact, as we've seen over only, the first 2 data collections. But the gender impact assessment That obligation is not situated in human resources. That is actually something that is necessary for anyone in an organisation who's designing a policy, program, or service for the public. And most of our organisations, our duty holders, do an awful lot of that. Designing, developing, delivering public service policies and programs. And so every single person who's doing that design must put a gender lens over it. And often they can't see at the start how this could possibly have anything to do with gender. And then they see, oh, okay, right. Putting this gender lens over it, I realized that there are different impacts, on people of different genders. And once you see that, you can't unsee that. So I think that, and Caroline Criado Perez's book, where I've got everyone that I can possibly promote it to, I think if she looked at her book sales in Victoria, she'd see that there's something going on here. And I have to say that I reckon we would be selling the most of them here in Victoria because it's one of those things that you read and you see that systemic pattern of exclusion over and over and over again in everything that we've designed. And I think that's what we're trying to undo here in Victoria, in part with this legislation.
We exist in a space of both the finance industry, which is one of the systems that we use that perpetuates the patriarchy more than most in so many different contexts, namely superannuation as a structure, investing as a structure, banking and the way that we assess credit and credit worthiness and all those sorts of things. But we also are in the startup space. And the startup space is one that is dominated by powerful men with capital. And they essentially do control much of what we see in the world. And I'm fortunate enough to call the wonderful Cindy Gallop a friend of mine. And Cindy has said on this podcast, actually, and I'm going to swear, so language warning, she said, fuck data. Data doesn't matter. And I want to ask you about and I think what she means by that in the context of startups and seeking investment is that the data says that women-led companies are more successful, and that doesn't cut through to investors. Now, I want to consider that in the context of your work. You work in the public sector. It's a very different space to venture capital, for example. And you have a lot of data available to you as a result of the policies that you're putting out there and seeking compliance with. Have you seen the data reflect the work you're doing with gender equality?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. I listened to that podcast and I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to talk all about how data is so important. And it is. And I can see why she said that. Basically she was saying that, data's one thing, but you actually need to change hearts and minds.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think both. I think data is really important for us. And we're in the public sector space. I think we've got to get our own house in order before we preach to anyone else around this stuff. But the Workplace Gender Equality Agency at a federal level collects data from the similar sort of data from private sector organisations with 100 plus people. They've been collecting that data for a long time. They have a really great database. Difference, I think, that the thing that makes the data count is WGEA has only just begun to publish the individual data for the individual organisations. You can collect all the data you want. If you publish it in aggregate, it doesn't hold anyone particularly to account. And that's the difference with our data. Every single organisation that reports under this legislation must publish their own data, their own gender equality action plans, and their own progress reports. And what the Act says is that the Commissioner may also publish them. Now, they have to publish them on their own public websites. But I made it very clear when I first was appointed as Commissioner that I will be publishing your data. And we developed a platform and an insights portal. The data gets submitted, we process, we clean it, we make sure it's been reported properly to the extent that we possibly can. And then we publish the data, the pay gaps, the sexual harassment experience in the organisation, the recruitment and promotion practices, the access to leave and flexible work. And we publish that for each individual organisation. So anyone in that organisation, a union, a person working there, a media, a journalist can go and have a look and say, what's going on here? And then they can look the next time they report 2 years later and look at their progress and what they're saying they've done about it and say, has it made an impact? And I think it's that individual holding organizations to account for their data that will drive the change more than anything. I do have really strong compliance powers, but I think that public transparency, that public accountability is really important.
Compliance powers are obviously more of a stick than a carrot, but you often speak about the business case for gender equality and making sure you communicate that with stakeholders. We know from research that people are happier in more equal societies and in more equal workplaces. That's not new. What kinds of outcomes in the context of a business case or employee satisfaction do you see in workplaces that do have greater gender equality than others?
Yeah. The business case is sometimes the only language that some people will listen to, and I use it strategically because I know it opens the door, or in my case, the door's usually open because it has to be where I want to have that conversation is with a duty holder. But it gets people in a conversation and starts them on the journey that moral arguments alone sometimes can't. And so, yes, I'll absolutely talk about how gender equality improves retention, drives innovation, and boosts profitability, because these things are measurably true and they get some people, particularly some leaders' attention. But I think what you're saying is we shouldn't need an economic rationale to treat people fairly. And I absolutely agree. And that's why I always now pair the economic rationale with the ethical one. It's not either or, it's both, because the business case gets some people listening, but values-based arguments create the lasting hearts and minds change, I think, in the end. And sometimes you have to work within a system's own logic to transform it, but you're absolutely right about the risk too. And I think when we over-rely on the business case, commitment can become transactional and conditional. What happens during an economic downturn when there are budget cuts or people cuts like there are in government now here in Victoria, that's kind of on the cards. Suddenly, equality becomes expendable. It's seen as a nice to have that gets cut first. And, even now I hear duty holders with the budget constraints in Victoria saying, how do you think we're going to do this? Because it's still not seen as something that is part of business as usual in that organisation. And thankfully, because of the privilege of being in this role and getting to do this work, I have something else I can say, not just the business case, not just the ethical or moral case, but it's the law. You have to do it because it's the law. But that most sustainable approach is building equality into the very fabric of how organisations operate. And I know that's kind of what you're wanting to do in setting up Maslow. We want it to be just the way that we do things around here. And then you don't abandon that. And I think that's what this legislation is aiming to do over time here in Victoria. It really does, there are organisations that just want to comply, but there are, I spend a lot of time on the road. In fact, I've visited almost all the duty holders under the legislation over the last few years, almost all, particularly in regional and rural Victoria, because I felt that was where I needed to get out and make the case. And, these obligations, once people get it and they understand why, they do much better. And so when we had our first round of progress reports where I wasn't seeing progress that I wanted to see, I made a point of then going out to meet with those particular organisations and talk about what was holding them back and so forth. I do think we have a real opportunity to create some form of systemic change, a redesign of public sector organisations that can be a model that others can use as well.
When working in any kind of systems change, it can get quite challenging. You've said you're not worried about resentment when it comes to pushing through gender equality reforms, and you've faced down police commissioners and fire chiefs who weren't exactly thrilled about your investigations. What have you learnt about institutional resistance, and how do you maintain momentum when really powerful interests or characters have every incentive to slow you down or water down your reforms and your...
Yeah, it's a great question. I do need to clarify that I was invited into both the South Australian Police and the Metropolitan Fire Service in South Australia to do those reviews, to undertake independent reviews, but they weren't happy with with the
What
findings.
what you found?
And that's not surprisingly, they were pretty awful from a gender equality perspective, but that wasn't on me, that was on them. And I would have to say that both leaders and a lot of the leadership in those organizations definitely took that on board at the time, to their credit. But what I learned from those experiences is that institutional resistance comes in many forms, and it's rarely about confusion. It's more about control. When people push back against reforms like what we're doing here in Victoria, it's often because they feel something valuable is being threatened, and they're not wrong. Real equality does disrupt hierarchies and erodes privilege that has been so normalized that people don't realize their privileges. And that institutional resistance really can manifest as kind of active opposition, which I think is actually easier to deal with, where, there's that kind of reaction that I sometimes get from people about, why are you doing this, etc. Or you are often, promoting inequality, in some strange way in
Yeah.
people's minds. So leaders openly undermining change. And then there's the passive resistance. It's not a shout, it's a shrug. And, that can be denial, delay, formative gestures like we support this in principle, followed by absolutely nothing. And you'll see that, endless consultations that go nowhere, policies implemented on paper but not in practice. And there's also systemic resistance built into existing structures, recruitment processes that by default favor certain groups, decision making that excludes particular voices, cultural norms that make the change feel uncomfortable. And that's one of the reasons why the Gender Equality Act, requires that the implementation of action plans, on top of making them public and the data public and requiring that organisations make reasonable and material change, progress every 2 years, it also requires that those plans are properly funded. The implementation of the development and the implementation is properly funded, and that duty holders have to report to me on that. Over time, I've had a light touch initially. Everyone was getting their heads around the Act. We had the first set of gender equality action plans we've had now in 2020. We had the first progress reports, which was based on 2023 data. So it was only a couple of years. And, and I didn't clamp down too much on organisations that didn't demonstrate compliance. But I'm out speaking publicly about how that will change now. Everyone's had enough time to get their head around it, what we're wanting. I've strengthened what is required of organisations now, what I suggested they should provide me, I've now said they must provide me, and so on and so forth. And so we'll get tougher. I'll get tougher over my second term, because we owe it to people of all genders to have gender equality in our workplaces. And that way, we also know, holding people account means that good intentions don't disappear into bureaucratic inertia. I think the other thing that I think is important is that what I was talking about before when I said, people are afraid of what they might lose. And I think that's the thing. We often talk about people being resistant to change, and I don't agree. I mean, we all love change if it's good for us. We resist loss, right? We're worried in this case potentially about self-esteem, status, relevance, identity. So figuring that out for someone, then you can kind of work with that. And the other thing I've said a lot, and said it to my team recently when we're looking at the resistance and backlash that's coming out of the US, not only the US, but particularly in the US, it's kind of in our faces at the moment. Most people who wake up in the morning don't go, I'm going to be evil today, right? Most people get up in the morning and we all are the heroes in our own story. We think we're good people. We are going out to do good in the world, and we want to get rid of things that we see as wrong. And so often I think when people are opposed to us, we think of them as evil and nasty and wanting to do the wrong thing. And actually that isn't the case. We mostly all believe that we're on the side of right. So telling people who oppose us that they're wrong isn't going to work any better than them telling us that we're wrong. And so that's why I try to approach resistance with more of a generous spirit, even when it's hard, and often it is hard, and try to acknowledge their perspectives as real, which they are, and not coming from an evil place. and I try to have a conversation, create spaces for hearing those voices that oppose what we do. And I can tell you that's not easy, because many people today, I think, refuse to listen to diversity of views. And I would say that's people on all sides of different debate, progressive and conservative alike. But I think it's really important, and it's something that I hope people see when I go out and speak to organisations. I might often, I'll be in a local council, there's a sea of high vis in front of me, usually mostly men working outside, hard labour often, who don't feel privileged, who worry that, I'm trying to demonise them, or I don't like men and so forth. But I share my own stories. I've got 2 sons as well as 2 daughters, and one of them's in construction, and, I try to talk about his experience. It's tough. It's a really tough place to work. And, to hear their voices as well. And I think the other thing that's really important is we talked a lot about women. We're talking a bit more about people who don't identify in that binary of men and women. We don't have a lot of data. We're building that over time. But we don't talk a lot about men. And I think that's really important, because gender stereotypes harm men. They box men into narrow kind of forms of masculinity, and they feel like they have to carry the sole burden of financial provision. If they're more likely, if they want to take parental leave, to get declined, or want to work flexibly, to get declined, or to get shunned by their colleagues, and they're not able to express vulnerability, and that's harmful. And many men want to do better, and they find that's a struggle. So yeah, that's kind of the way that I approach that resistance. As we're making progress if we're getting resistance. And I think the other thing is to say, focus on the movable middle, not the die-hard resistors, because they'll be the ones kicking and screaming right to the end, and you could waste a lot of energy there.
I have a psychology background. It was the first thing I studied when I left school. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I figured I better try and work out how people work.
And you in good stead for everything, right? I have a PhD in psychology.
Absolutely. It was the most useful thing I've ever studied at university, other than potentially my paramedic degree, which does come in handy quite acutely sometimes. But one of the things I've always been quite interested in psychology, but also the causation problems. And I think one of the most unfortunate correlations we're experiencing at the moment is we live in a society that does encourage us to be the hero of our own story, as you said. But we also, as people, very few of us actually possess the self-awareness required to self-regulate that story. Yeah. And, that was one of the reasons why one of the most important character traits I look for in the people I surround myself with is self-awareness, so that I can hope as much as possible that my close circle has the ability to reflect on their own actions and behavior. And I think as we head down that track of hyper individualism and, the social media age, and it's about me, and I can, and we do give a lot of people more rights. It's I think has to go hand in hand with a consideration that maybe that has larger consequences for the collective.
Yeah. Look, I totally agree with you. And I also, as I said, have a PhD now in psychology. And I was fascinated. My PhD's was before I started as a commissioner in South Australia or Victoria. I ran an organisation called the Leaders Institute of South Australia. I developed that organisation myself from a program that we took on and grew from 2002 in South Australia, built on community leadership models. So it wasn't the first. It followed a model here in Victoria as well, and others in Sydney and other places. And it was about trying to get wiser leadership into our organisations, leaders who think beyond their own organisation and think about the consequences of their decisions in organisations on the broader community. And it was is still an incredibly successful program, and has made a real impact. I would think there's probably something like 800 people who have gone through that program now, leaders in South Australia, including some of the people in politics, even in South Australia currently. And it really opened people's eyes to that kind of, that there was a bigger consequence consequence for decisions, it was important to think in a systemic way about how everything was interconnected and so forth. And, we would put leaders in prison for a day. We would take them
Yeah.
out to Aboriginal communities for a day, put them on farms with farmers and so forth, so they could get to experience a world very different to their own. And that's what I did my PhD on in the end. And I think that opens up that self-awareness, that those windows, I think that you're really talking about, that if you kind of don't put yourself out of your comfort zone, and I've been privileged to have been able to do that in lots of ways, you can have a very narrow focus. And I see that on all sides of politics, as I say, left and right, and often in between as well, but mostly at the sort of hard edge of left and right, where it's my way or the highway. And that doesn't work. It's not going to work. It's not going to help make anything better, I think.
Working in the complexity and in the weeds of systems change is an incredible privilege that most people don't have. To, get paid a wage to focus on problems that, 20-year-old Niki didn't have the privilege to focus on is an incredible opportunity. But because of that, we often exist in a space where we have time to consider a lot of information. And because of that, I'm often looking for the things I hear from others that cut through for a layperson, someone that is just under pressure in life, language that sort of makes sense to them. And a friend of mine recently I met on the island of Guernsey, Jamie Prow, said to me of the problems with the individual approach to society. And he summarized the problem really well. He said, we've got democracy wrong. When we go to the polls, what we're asking is what a candidate can do for me. If we all went to the polls and thought about the person in our life that had the hardest time and asked what could a candidate do for them, we would fundamentally change the way we view society as something that we are a part of, not something that we are owed.
Yeah, that's powerful. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, there was that old saying by, I think it was Kennedy. Well, no, maybe it wasn't. Maybe he just said it as well, but it was,
ask not.
Yeah, ask not what you can do, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for
What
your
you can
country.
do for your country. I think it was Kennedy. I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay.
Or maybe it wasn't. Then again, no. It sounds like a wartime rally, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Absolutely.
You've spoken about your compliance powers, but you've also spoken about how you want to bring everyone along. I spend a lot of my time trying to work out the best approach to broadening debate, to getting more people in the room and extending a dialogue. Just the other day, I was at a lecture by Catherine Trebek, who obviously works in regenerative economics and the Wellbeing Economics Alliance. And Catherine said, we have to use inviting language. We have to bring people along. We can't be abrasive or aggressive or obstructive in the language we use. You have compliance powers. I want to ask you about the limits of that regulatory approach to achieving equality and what needs to happen beyond regulation to create lasting cultural change.
Yeah, I do. And I have said that I hope that transparency will drive the change that we need to make. I think that rather than using my compliance powers is the most important thing that I can focus on. And so we've really gone for that sort of radical transparency, precedented transparency. As I said, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency is only now just starting to publish the individual pay gaps. And you've seen the hoo-ha about that in the media when pay gaps were published, and the organisations coming out to sort of, how do we explain this sort of thing? And it's funny because they knew what their pay gap was. They've been reporting it to ATIA for a very long time. And so that transparency is the next step that you need. And so I think there are limits to the regulatory approaches, but there are ways to strengthen regulatory approaches like transparency, as we have in our legislation, that can make them more powerful than other forms of regulation. I do prefer bringing people along because regulation alone isn't going to create the deep cultural change that we need, but it is crucial. And the Act has achieved in 3 years what decades of voluntary approaches and talking about this, have failed to deliver. So we've now got this, we've got about 100 million data points now from what is covering about 450,000 employees. We, when we originally said 380, we'd left out universities, I think, or something like that. So we've recalculated that. We've seen measurable progress. We've seen pay gap reductions. We've seen a 5% increase in women CEOs just in 2 years. And we've seen men taking more parental leave, taking longer parental leave, not by a stunning amount, but, step in the right direction. And we've seen over 1,500 of these gender impact assessments done on policies, programs and services. So I think that regulation creates the conditions for change, but you're not going to regulate away unconscious bias in the minds of hiring managers, and you can't regulate away the subtle career penalties that still exist for people who use flexible work or part-time work. Cultural change really requires leadership at every level, not just from the CEO, but from middle managers who shape the day-to-day experiences of people that they work with. And our research shows that women with disability, for instance, often limit their career progression to stay with supportive managers, which tells us that individual leaders can create pockets of inclusion even when the broader organisational culture hasn't really caught up. And the reverse is also true, but it also shows the limitation of depending on individual champions, because when inclusion depends on finding the right manager, we haven't achieved that systemic change. So we need organisations where support for inclusion is built into how things work, as I said, not dependent on individual goodwill. And that requires changing hearts and minds, and it requires people to examine their own biases, to listen to experiences from people who are different to them, to give up some comfort and convenience to make space for others. And that's where our transparency requirements become powerful beyond just accountability. When people do see the data and they really see it, it can be transformational. And many organisations have told us that they were absolutely shocked by their own numbers. They didn't know they had pay gaps. They couldn't believe they had them, but there they were. Sexual harassment rates were higher than they expected. Women were disappearing from leadership pipelines, but that data alone isn't enough. You need the stories behind the numbers. And, we've also done additional funded research which brings those stories to light. So Aboriginal women, First Nations women describing the cultural load they carry, women with disability explaining how they constantly have to advocate for themselves, women talking about having to anglicise their names to get interviews. And lasting cultural change requires much beyond regulation, but good regulation creates the conditions for cultural change, which then makes further progress easier. And I would argue that's what I saw when I looked at the Gender Equality Act before I made the decision to apply for this role, was the potential for that systemic change that I quite frankly was not seeing in my role, or not feeling I could impact in my role as Equal Opportunity Commissioner in South Australia, where I was conciliating individual complaint after individual complaint of discrimination, racism, sexism, disability discrimination. And I would see the same perpetrators, individual and organisational perpetrators, often over and over and over again. So they weren't learning anything from the complaints that I was conciliating. And we also weren't funded enough to do what I believe needed to be done in terms of community education around that change. So we were left to just to conciliate complaints and not do much else. I spent a lot of time in the media because that was free. I could put myself out there and do that. That was the only education that we could really do to drive change, because we didn't have the funding for anything else. So when I looked at this legislation and I saw the transparency and I saw the accountability every 2 years to make reasonable and material progress, I thought, and then I saw the gender impact assessments and I thought, that's really thoughtful, incredibly innovative legislation in many ways. And let's face it, it takes the best from other jurisdictions around the world. It's not all brand new, but it is new to have all of that coming together, and also to have intersectionality in there, and to require us not just to think about gender, but to think about how gender discrimination can be compounded by other forms of discrimination and disadvantage, like racism and ableism and ageism and so on and so forth.
I relate quite closely to your frustration in South Australia. What set me off on my journey that I'm on and might always be on was actually working as a paramedic, feeling like I was reacting to the same systemic social problems, structural problems all day, every day. There's a lot of focus and a lot of discussion on paramedic burnout and emergency services burnout. And I think a great deal of that comes from being a really ineffective, inefficient band-aid on gaping wounds that our society has in its structural
Yeah,
designs. And
yeah.
it's really nice to hear you sort of step away from that and go, I can't do the work I know needs to be done and that I want to do if I'm reacting only at all times.
And it's devastating
It is,
yeah, well, it's devastating when you see, the same organization, and another woman who's been sexually harassed, and you're like, yes, I'm getting compensation, but like, the ambulance
yeah,
at the bottom of the cliff, right?
absolutely.
You
Yeah.
don't want to be stopping people dropping off the cliff as opposed to picking them up when they've dropped over. And so it was, I put my hand up for this role. I was, I feel very privileged to be in this role. And I know I've got the most amazing team that are incredible. We all feel, like we pinch ourselves, I think, that we actually get to do this work. And it certainly helps you to feel like you have the power to make a difference. I think you have legislation behind you. It's a much better position from a psychological perspective to be in than bashing your head against a brick wall, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah. The I remember just how exhausting and pointless and futile it felt, and going home with that, like so many paramedics and healthcare workers do every day, is just such a hard and unsustainable thing. At Maslow, we argue that concentrating financial power in the hands of a few undermines democracy and perpetuates all other forms of inequality. From your perspective, working on gender equality, how do you see the relationship between economic power and other forms of discrimination? And do you think that democratizing finance could be crucial for achieving broader social justice goals? From your perspective, working on gender equality, how do you see the relationship between economic power and other forms of systemic discrimination? It might be in the way that people without economic power can or cannot respond to other forms of systemic discrimination, and maybe it's the specific reference to how those things intersect with each other.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, economic power shapes who gets to make decisions, whose voices get heard, and whose priorities matter. I'm actually listening to a podcast at the moment on the origin story of Elon Musk. And, there's a case in point of someone who, is in a position of incredible power, political power, simply because they made a lot of money. And it's fascinating. The background in science fiction and, that sort of thing is scary. I have to be frank. And I think, if financial institutions were genuinely accountable to their communities rather than their shareholders, and I think I've heard you talk about that in your original podcast in this series, they'd be much more responsive to equality concerns. But I think, when I think about what could be done about that, I think that connects us to our gender impact assessments, the things that we require public sector organizations to do, the things that Caroline Criado Perez has talked about. Is that something that could work in the finance industry? Could we require organizations to say, put a gender lens and think about the gendered impacts as a form of regulation in the finance sector? Put this gender lens over what you're doing, the work that you're doing, and that could make an impact. So I'm more curious to hear how you see that.
Well, I think you've touched on the vested interests of a company that reports to shareholders versus its stakeholders or its community more broadly or generally. We have a view that credit unions and member-owned banks have a very specific role to play in social change because of the economic power dynamic that exists in decision-making processes. And if they have to report to their customers who also happen to be their owners, by default, it's automatically an assumption that they are going to have a more diverse stakeholder set than a company that is reporting to people who have the money to buy shares, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
For our listeners who might be working in organizations or communities where inequality feels entrenched, what practical advice do you have? How do people start building the case for change at a real sort of grassroots street level?
I understand that frustration and how it can seem sort of an overwhelming, but I'm sure you would say, change always starts with someone deciding it's possible, and often that someone doesn't have formal authority. It rarely happens through individual heroics either. You absolutely need allies. So I would say start conversations, ask questions. You'll find that people have been observing the same patterns as you, but weren't sure if they were the only ones seeing them. So, find allies. You don't need a Gender Equality Act to start collecting data. In fact, if you are anywhere outside of Victoria and working in the private sector, you can, go and have a look at the data that the Workplace Gender Equality Agency collects on organisations and now is reporting pay gaps of. And, that's where you can start to look at what's the pay gap in your organization. But you can also start looking internally and gathering data internally if you're in an organization or in a community. But in an organization, look at who gets promoted, who gets to speak in meetings, who's listened to when they speak. Start sort of thinking about those things and documenting them, because data really does make what's invisible visible. And then when people see patterns that they hadn't noticed before, it becomes harder to dismiss the concerns just as individual grievances. And you're probably not going to like this, Kane, but I do think translating equality concerns into business language in some workplaces can help open doors, as I said, and get leaders listening. And so I would say, don't just say this is unfair, because it is unfair, but say we're missing out on talent, we're not getting the best ideas, we're creating legal and reputational risks. I think that's important. And that's the kind of language that often makes people sit up and pay attention, especially things like financial and reputational risks. I think don't try to solve everything at once. I remember when I took this job on, and it was huge. It was like a startup because it was brand new legislation. It was just about to come into effect. We didn't have an office. We didn't have staff. It was the middle of the pandemic. I moved to Victoria and went straight into lockdown with my foster daughter and set the whole thing up, employing everyone online from my rented apartment with my foster daughter who couldn't go to TAFE. And so it was kind of, like starting it up in your garage, basically, a little bit more comfortable than that. But I had huge, I was thinking about, we could, translate this internationally and, everyone needs to know about it. And yes, that's all true. But actually we needed to get it going first, and get the data in and show that it's successful. Now, I've been talking to the World Bank, and I've been, talking to, actually, you mentioned, did you say Guernsey, the island of Guernsey?
Guernsey, yeah.
The Jersey government asked me to speak to them, which is, similar sort of British island.
Just an island over the sea, yes?
Yeah, that's right. And others, other jurisdictions in Australia have been talking to, but I had to go, let's just try and, let's just narrow what we are trying to achieve here until we get things up and running. So don't try to solve everything at once. Pick one concrete, achievable change and focus on that. And when you achieve that change, then you build the credibility and momentum for bigger things and other changes. So even without legislation, there are things like external pressures you can leverage. So industry standards, customer expectations, reputational considerations, like I said. And most organisations don't want to be seen to be behind the curve on gender equality. You can show the cost of inequality, not just the benefits as well. High turnover among talented women costs money, sexual harassment hurts victims often terribly, and lawsuits cost money, and that to that end as well. So, keep records, when someone says we don't have a problem here, you might be able to, bring them to specific examples. And you can often learn from other organisations and look at what they're doing. And, many are very happy to share what works and so forth. And, for organisations, private sector organisations, have a look at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's Employer of Choice citation holders, because they're examples of organisations, private sector organisations, that are doing well on gender equality. And so you can use them as reference points. And there's quite a bit of literature about those organisations that I've used to drive change here in Victoria. So, I think it's hard not to get discouraged when progress feels slow. And I'm probably the most impatient person to be in a role like this, where you're going to see that, it has to take time and so forth. But we have seen measurable progress, small, but measurable progress, as I've said. But I've also seen hearts and minds change. And, as I said, I do a lot of public speaking. I've seen and I've been told people have aha moments, they get it. The penny drops for them. I can't tell you how many people where I've said, read this book, and they've come back and said, I've read that book, and, now I get it, that sort of thing. So, I think it's great to be working on a piece of legislation where it's just the public sector, because it's constrained. WGEA has like 5,000 organisations reporting to them. We have 300. It's easy enough for me. It's hard work, but it is easy enough and doable for me to get out and meet with them all. Not so for Mary Waldridge, who heads up WGEA, to get around to those 5,000. So I think, we can see the change happening before our eyes, and that's exciting.
We like to finish these interviews with what I call a hopes and dreams question. And we like to ask, if we lived in a magic world and there was a switch that you could flick to make the biggest change or the biggest positive social impact in the world, what would it be?
Well, can I have a magical one? Because
yeah, absolutely. It's a magical question.
So if I had a magic wand, people are definitely going to take umbrage at this because I'm not asking them. If I had a magic wand, I would wave it and I would overnight make everyone drop every gender stereotype that they have, because that would be very interesting to wake up the next morning and not have those kind of gendered expectations about everything. And I think sometimes we don't even realize those expectations, gender norms around us. It would cause a lot of chaos, but I would love that we didn't kind of have gender reveal parties where we already, before the baby's even born, we're thinking about what color the nursery is going to be based on its gender, and all of that sort of thing that starts from before a child is born and then influences decisions that are made for them and about them, and decisions that they make right through their lives and how they're channeled, in certain ways. So if I had a magic wand, that's kind of what I'd do without asking anyone's permission to do that. But I think, to be practical, one of the things that I think, and I've seen this in European countries where you see men being much more, in heterosexual couples, being much more involved with their children, where you've got use it or lose it paid parental leave for both parents. So, men get a certain amount of parental leave. If they don't use it, they can't give it to their partner. They have to use it. And what you see is that men are much more actively involved in raising their children. I think that over time that helps to get rid of some of those gendered norms about who does caring and so forth. It's not eliminated it completely, but it certainly dampens it down. Men then have greater insight into the challenge of unpaid caring work and how that is work, and it's hard work, and it's something that we do not value in our society, and it should be valued, but it also makes them better fathers and they have better families. I mean, there's actual research that shows that they are much better fathers if they've done that. And so I think that has the potential for really transformational change. So if I didn't have a magic wand and I just had political clout that could get that over the line, that's probably where I'd go, I think.
Dr. Niki Vincent, thank you so much for joining Chasing Financial Equality today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really good conversation.